Hey pushers, this is going to be a mini lecture on the Roaring Twenties, and it's going to be focusing on three main topics. On the politics of the period, it's going to be focusing on the economy, and then it's going to be focusing on the technologies. We're going to be covering these things in other areas throughout this unit, but this is going to front load some of that major information so that the rest of those details that come later will make more sense. So our first topic is going to be about politics. And this is known as the Republican decade. During the 1920s, we are going to have three Republican presidents. On the left-hand side, we have Warren G. Harding, in the middle, Calvin Coolidge, and to the right-hand side, we have Herbert Hoover. So we're going to be looking at what are some of the trends within this period of time, and we're going to look specifically at how these Republican candidates are going to kind of create the new form of the Republican government, one that we're going to be much more familiar with the Republican Party today. So the first thing, isolationism and protectionism. They really focused on America not being involved in other countries' issues. They wanted to make sure that the United States was mainly focusing on kind of an America first policy so that we could keep out of any kind of European conflict. We didn't get sucked into the inflation problems that existed in Europe and those types of things. We also are going to see with these Republicans that they are going to be supportive of laissez-faire economics. They are going to try and make sure that businesses are given full opportunity to do what they need to do in order to make as much money as possible, to improve and expand the economy, as well as they are going to do a lot to remove a lot of regulations, including the removal of antitrust laws. The antitrust laws that we see come out of the progressive era, many of these Republicans of the 1920s felt that those were very restrictive towards business, specifically looking at ones that prevented certain types of mergers and things like that that allowed businesses to grow. And so they felt that it was restrictive, it kept America's economy from reaching its potential, and so they were looking to eliminate those antitrust laws. Also going along with this kind of promotion of American big business and the economy is going to be high tariffs. For example, we're going to have the Fordney-McCumber tariff, where we're going to raise tariff rates to 38%, as an attempt to help domestic business. But this is going to hurt those European countries that are still recovering from World War I and make it even harder for them to pay back those World War I debts. So good for us, bad for them. Good for American business. One group that tariffs always end up hurting, though, are American farmers. So we'll talk about what happens to the farmers during the 1920s in just a bit. We're also going to see that labor unions struggle during this period. Generally, we're going to see that the 1920s are a prosperous time. So because of that, people don't really join unions. But the other reason why unions struggle is because they are a threat to the productivity of business. And therefore, it is not going to be something supported by the Republican Party. And finally, tax cuts. They are going to have lots of tax cuts, mainly for corporations and for the wealthy, with the idea that those corporations and the wealthy would then reinvest it into the American economy. And we'll be looking at this a little bit more in detail in just a few minutes. So our first president that we're going to have in the 1920s is going to be Warren G. Harding. Now, Warren G. Harding is about as opposite as you can get from the previous president, Woodrow Wilson. Warren G. Harding is he's folksy, he's funny, he's laid back, he's the kind of guy that you want to invite to your barbecue. Whereas Woodrow Wilson is, he is uptight, he is elitist, as well as that he is extremely intelligent and did have a tendency to kind of talk down to people. And they did feel that they kind of feel that feeling of inferiority around him. So when you have this very kind of folksy, average guy type that comes in with the presidency, he becomes very popular. Also, he's popular because of his campaign promise of a return to normalcy. Now, his version of normalcy was essentially that he was going to bring us back to a pre-World War I America. Now, not necessarily in the sense of America would, be able to take back some of the things that it did, but rather that during World War I, we became very, involved in outside issues. So this is going to be isolationist. But really the biggest focus of the normalcy is going back to a pre-progressive era. He wants to go back to the Gilded Age, to the good old days of big business. And he feels that the period of progressivism had put too many limitations on business, too many limitations on the government. It was a little too like, hey, I want my rights. And he said, that's not the government's job. And so Americans were wanting to be prosperous again. And so they were, very excited about this new philosophy. The unfortunate thing for Warren G. Harding, though, is that because he was, and this is, a pretty well-known fact, that he was of average or even below average intelligence and extremely gullible. And because of that, he needed a lot of people around him to essentially run the government for him because he just didn't have the intelligence to do it on his own. And so, unfortunately, the people that he brings in are guys that had been either in his government while he was governor of Ohio, but also just some of his regular friends, even guys who are his poker buddies. And these guys are known as the Ohio Gang. And these guys were super corrupt. They sold government positions, they gave criminal pardons, they laundered money, they took bribes, they did all kinds of really, really shady, corrupt stuff. And that is going to end up biting him and the administration in the butt. And the best example of this is the Teapot Dome scandal. So the Teapot Dome scandal starts off when oil is found near Teapot Dome, Wyoming. And this is going to fall under the administration of Albert B. Fall, the Secretary of the Interior. His job is to regulate and to deal with and organize all of America's natural resources, especially oil. And instead of doing what he should have done, which is, have it regulated and have it be, to kind of be done by the federal government, he had the land secretly placed under his control. He accepted bribes for oil drilling rights. And then he starts having other members of the cabinet and members of Congress getting involved. Next thing you know, word leaks out, the case is going to drag on, and it is going to drag on for 6 long years. And it is going to drag a lot of people in Warren G. Harding's administration down with it. And aside from the just traditional corruption and bribery, when it went to trial, they ended up being found guilty of also jury and evidence tampering, as well as trying to sway the judge and essentially bribe the judge. Now, you'd think to yourself, well, how this is going to make Warren G. Harding look? Well, a lot of people figured he probably didn't know what was going on. He probably wasn't smart enough to figure it out. And even if he did, it didn't have an impact on him because, well, he died. So Warren G. Harding's out. So when the president dies, who takes over? The vice president. And that's going to be Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge could not have been any more different from Warren G. Harding. Harding dies of pneumonia, and Coolidge comes in, and he is quiet, he is shy, he is extremely moral, he is extremely conservative, and he is even more pro-business than even Warren G. Harding was. And so he's going to be kind of even more laissez-faire, and he's going to fulfill kind of the last little part of Harding's administration, and then he's going to run for president on his own steam. And that his, slogan, which is one of the more well-known ones, is "Keep cool with Coolidge," which I think is just super cheesy, but I love it. But what he's best known for, ladies and gents, and what his most, revealing quote is where he said that the chief business of the American people is business, essentially saying that the United States is not only best known for business, but it is the most important thing to us and the thing that is the most essential part of who we are as a nation. And so he is going to do a lot in his administration that is very pro-business and many times at the expense of people who are either not in business, aka farmers, as well as is going to hurt potentially the average worker. And this is going to be a great example of it. So as I said, times are tough for farmers. In fact, everybody seems to benefit from the 1920s except farmers. And it's because of the tariff, but it also has issues because of World War I. So while World War I was happening, we have really high farm prices. Why? We're feeding an entire army, both Americans and the Allies. Super high demand allows farmers to sell lots and lots of food, but on top of that, to produce more of this food, they then purchased very expensive farm equipment that allowed them to produce so much more. The downside of that, when the war ends, there is a massive drop in demand, not feeding an army anymore. The farm equipment was incredibly costly, so they have a lot to pay with not a lot of money coming in. That leads to these low farm prices. The farmers go into extreme debt, and they are now losing their farms. Surprisingly, this Republican Congress actually tries to keep agriculture prices high. Congress passes laws, one in specific, which is called the McNary-Haugen Bill, and the idea was that they were going to buy the farm surpluses, then sell them to other nations. This is good for farmers because they are getting paid, they're selling their crops. It's good for the American government because they're going to be able to sell this food and make a profit, as well as it's good for the other countries that are still struggling to get by. However, this idea is vetoed by Coolidge twice, mainly because he was of the philosophy that it is not the government's job to bail people out. So you can see his government philosophy very, very clearly in how he deals with American farmers. Our last president of the 1920s is going to be Herbert Hoover. Now, in this election of 1928, we have Herbert Hoover, who's a Republican from Ohio, who's going to be running against Alfred E. Smith, who's a Democrat and the governor of New York. With this election, one of the things that makes it really unique is that it is highly influenced by the radio. By 1928, most Americans own a radio. And what's really exciting is that it is the very first election in which the presidential debate will be done live over the radio. That means no matter where you live in the country, you are going to be able to hear the presidential debate and make a decision for yourself who is better fit to run the country. Now, why this is going to be so influential in this election? Herbert Hoover is from Ohio. Alfred E. Smith is very much loved by the American public. He's very, very popular in his home state of New York. New York is extremely populous as a state. So that seems to go well for him. He's also a big supporter of eliminating prohibition, and which we'll talk more about in another lesson. But a lot of people wanted to end prohibition because it just didn't seem to be working, and people wanted to have alcohol back. So that was definitely something in his, in his camp, and yet he doesn't win. There are two big things that really lead to the downfall of Alfred Smith as a potential candidate. Number one, he's Catholic, and America just wasn't ready for a Catholic president yet. But the other thing that is going to be shockingly influential was the radio. He's from New York, and Alfred Smith had a thick, grating New York accent. And if you are not from New York, this kind of accent just is nails across the chalkboard for you. And so then when you hear Herbert Hoover from Ohio with no accent, you are really swayed by that. And shockingly enough, this is going to have an impact on the election, and the way that a person sounds as well as how they look will become increasingly more and more and more important as presidential campaigns go on. Now, the other things that are going to be beneficial for Herbert Hoover are some of his philosophies that come out in his campaign. One of these is the slogan that he will have a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. And essentially this is saying that he is going to bring a very prosperous America. And he was a Republican, Coolidge was a Republican, Harding was a Republican, and the country had been doing really well so far. So why don't we keep going with these Republicans and their policies and see if we can keep this train a-running? So it was a very popular thing. The other thing that's very popular for him is his slogan of rugged individualism. This idea that America had been made by these strong, self-sufficient individuals, people who could solve their problems just by working a little bit harder. America was made by people who pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps. And Americans really liked this idea. It did resonate with us about our own self-sufficiency and individualism. And so this is going to be a really popular idea. And so he is going to be the last president that is elected during the 1920s. The next topic we have is looking at the economy of the 1920s and making the 1920s roar. And the reason that it's even called the Roaring Twenties is because of the massive economic boom during this period of time. A lot of those Republican policies did help foster a very large and prosperous economy. Now, I also don't want you to think it was solely because of those policies. One of the biggest things that also helped during this period of time is a massive technological boom that is going to foster a strong economy. And also the fact that America was really one of the only major nations who got out of World War I really unscathed economically. Britain, France, Germany, they had all spent their entire treasuries fighting that war. America, having gotten into the war so late, didn't have those extreme debts. And so because of this, America was able to put more money into innovation, put more effort into expanding our economy. So those three things together helped create this very strong economic boom. And it was really good for virtually everybody. The American wage soared 22% over the decade. That is a lot of money. That goes, essentially, making an extra $22 per 100 by the end of the decade. That's a lot more money in your pocket, which means you can spend more of that money. The other thing that's amazing is that they're making a lot more money doing a lot less work. The hours and the days decreased. We went from an average 5 to 6 day work week with a roughly 10-hour work day to now the average and kind of the standard today, 5-day work week, 8-hour work day. And so you are working less, making more with more disposable income, allowing you more time for entertainment and leisure buying. And what also is interesting is we have Americans going on vacation for the first time. And I'll explain in just a couple of minutes how and why that became a sudden trend. Now, the economic policies that are going to be fostered by the Republicans during this period of time are going to be very popular in creating excess dollars. And a lot of that is because of this guy, Andrew Mellon. Andrew Mellon was the Secretary of the Treasury throughout the 1920s for Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. And the reason that they all selected this guy is because he was one of the wealthiest men in the world. He actually is on the top 20 list of wealthiest Americans ever. So, he's on that same list with Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and Carnegie and so on. So the guy knows how to make a buck. So the idea was, if he can make so much money for himself, he could surely make money for the country. And he did believe that the government should operate like a business. So he said, don't spend more money than you have. And those really basic business policies were not really being followed by the federal government. Now, one policy that he was very in favor of, that was popular among Republicans then and still remains popular among Republicans today, is something called supply side economics. It's also referred to as trickle-down economics. Now, trickle-down economics, here's kind of the way it works. You are going to give tax cuts, especially for the wealthy. This means that people have more disposable income. They have more money in their pocket. The intention, the idea, is that those people with more money in their pocket are going to be able to then invest it or spend the extra money. Wealthy people are going to invest in an American business, or they're going to buy more American goods. And especially those luxury goods, there's going to be heavy taxes on those. So it's going to not only make more money for the federal government, but it's going to create more jobs. It's also going to trickle that money down to the middle and lower classes, because the upper class has extra money, and so they spend it in businesses owned by the middle class. The middle class has more money now, so they are going to spend it, and they are going to be able to expand their businesses, being able to hire more people in the lower class. So the idea is that it's supposed to trickle down. The problem is it doesn't. And where the problem lies is right here. Because when the wealthy people have more money, the idea is that they're going to invest and spend that extra money. Our expectation is that they're going to spend this in American businesses. But American businesses are expensive. American goods are expensive. You know what countries are struggling and really need investment right now, and I can make a much bigger profit? Maybe someplace like Germany. And so they spend their extra dollars in Germany, not the United States. And they're going to buy goods from foreign countries because overall they're cheaper, because they don't have the same labor laws, etc., that we do. And as a result, the money doesn't trickle down, the money trickles out. It's good for a short-term fix, but it doesn't work for the long term. And this is actually going to be one of those long-term things that will eventually lead us towards the Great Depression. So we realize that this is not going to be a good long-term fix. Final thing, looking at business and the economy and kind of like keeping that going, is going to be the official changes to how businesses run. Now, the big business changes is that we're going to see much more modern organizational business structures. For example, we get the first divisions like the marketing division, the sales division, the accounting division, etc., etc. The idea was we're going to get experts in a specific field, and that's all they're going to do. And we're going to separate them from everybody else so that they can be as productive as possible. And that worked out really well because, you know, not everybody is good at sales and marketing and accounting. Let's just get the experts in each field. The other thing that ends up happening is that they start using more managers, middle management, where there is, and I'm not talking like a floor manager who makes sure that, like, you know, like you're putting the right widget in the right box, but rather the kind of like middle guys who are the head of the, you know, marketing department, the head of the accounting department. Those managers are now going to help increase the middle class. And so with a rise in the middle class, those people have much more disposable income, and they are going to spend a lot of their disposable income here in the United States. They don't have enough money to invest it outside of the U.S. So it's really the middle class that helps foster this very strong economy in the 1920s. Companies also are going to start using something called welfare capitalism, where companies are going to provide opportunities and services to their employees to encourage loyalty and productivity. Things like medical benefits. Now, if you think about it, why on earth would a company pay for you to go to the doctor? Like, that just doesn't seem right. But then when you think about it, a healthy worker is a better worker. So it is to their benefit to make sure that you can go to the doctor. And then things like a pension. Why should they pay you after you stop working there? Well, if you work there for a long period of time, you're able to be eligible for a pension. So it gets people to be more loyal to the company and stay there longer. What about vacations? Paid vacations are a new thing. Why would I pay you to not work for me? Well, what happens when people go on vacation? They come back refreshed, relaxed, and they end up working harder and better. Plus, I want to work for a place that does give vacations rather than the place that doesn't. So it makes them more competitive for workers. The downside during the 20s, we're going to see unionization start to falter. Why are you going to join a union if times are good? So it is a rough time for unions, and that is going to make things a lot more unstable as we reach the end of the 1920s. And yes, is a contributing factor to part of why so many people are going to struggle during the beginning of the Great Depression. Now, last thing when it comes to business is the stock market. You're going to need to know these terms because we're going to talk about them quite a bit, as well as they're going to go along with some of the activities we're going to do throughout this unit. So first of these, what is a stock? So imagine stock as partial ownership within a company. Okay, so if I have Disney stock, that means that I have partial ownership in Disney. That means if Disney is going to spend a lot of its money, a lot of its profits on something, they have to ask the owners, aka the stock owners, if they think that's okay. And so this is going to not only help you invest in a company so the company can grow, but also you are able to then benefit from their profits, which are often called dividends. So they'll pay you some of their profits in dividends. Buying on margin. Imagine, if you will, a piece of paper, right? So we've got our paper here and we've got all of our lines. Think about the margin. It's only a very small portion of the overall paper. Buying on margin is essentially paying for an entire stock, but only paying for a little bit of it. So I have only purchased this much of the actual stock. I still owe this much left. The idea is that as the stock value goes up, I will be able to pay this off over time. It's almost like buying stock like in installments or buying it on credit. The good thing is you're able to invest in stocks that otherwise you may not be able to afford, which allows you to get involved in the stock market and to, invest in an American business. That's great. Downside is that you do still have to pay off the rest of this. And if you don't, they can call your margin. And that means you have to pay off the rest of this all at once. And if you can't afford it, you're going to have something else taken away. So that's not necessarily a good thing. Another issue at this time is something called speculation. Speculation meaning guessing. And it was essentially guessing. Now, this is always done on the stock market because you can't say for sure if something's going to go up or if something's going to go down. But speculation was so rampant at this time, and people were overvaluing stocks or guessing that they were going to go up much more than they actually were, etc., etc., etc. At this time, that it was really unsafe because people were taking advice from people who had no idea what they were talking about, stuff that they had just heard from someone on the subway kind of thing, and actually investing life savings into it. It is an incredibly dangerous method of investing, and speculation was rampant, and there was nothing to rein it in. Now, we have 4 quick animals that we have to learn about, and it's just going to be terms that help you with some of the activities we're going to do. So the first of these is a bull market. A bull market is, in front of the New York Stock Exchange, you see this beautiful, gigantic statue of a bull. Why do we have a bull there? Because we always are hoping for a bull market. If you think about how a bull attacks, the bull is going to go ahead and it's going to stick its horns into something and then throw it over its back. So essentially, how does a bull market go? It goes upward. We do not want a bear market. What happens with a bear market or with a bear when it attacks? A bear stands straight up on its hind legs and swipes down with its arms. And so we don't want a bear market because that means it's going downward. So bull market up, bear market down. The next one is a market chicken. If you call someone chicken, you're calling them a coward. And that's exactly what a market chicken is. They are cautious. They don't take risks. They're going to go with whatever's safe. They're probably not going to make a lot of money in the short term, but their investments are going to be safer, so they're probably going to make a good amount of money in the long run. A market pig is very, very greedy. And so the pig is going to potentially make a lot of money in a short period of time, but could also lose a lot of money in a short period of time because it's a lot more of a volatile way of trading. And so during this period of time, most people who are trading are going to be pigs. And they are unfamiliar with the system because they're new to the market. Most of them are going to be middle class, new middle class who are going to be joining the market. But also that there's this rumor and this speculation that everything's going so great. Why wouldn't I invest in something I've never heard of before? Because of course it's going to go up. And unfortunately, that's just not the way that it works. And our last topic is going to be the major inventions of this period and how they're going to affect the 1920s as a whole, economically, etc. So, our first one is going to be looking at consumer culture as a whole. So we have tons and tons and tons of new goods that are available. We have improved technology, and we also, because of a rising middle class and people have more disposable income, we have increased demand. So with all of this new disposable income, people are going to want to buy all of these new products. We have watches, we have automobiles, we are going to have radios, we're going to have toasters, we're going to have vacuum cleaners, washing machines, sliced bread, all major new inventions and technologies at the time period that everybody is going to want to buy. And a lot of these are going to be quote unquote convenience items, items that make your life easier and less time consuming for you to accomplish certain tasks. Most of these are going to be advertised via radio. As much as the catalog that we saw from like the Gilded Age was the big revolutionary thing, they're still going to have those in the 20s and they're still going to be really important. But it's the radio that changes advertising. It's the radio that's going to change the way that people buy. Because everybody across the nation is hearing these same radio ads. They are in the midst of your favorite programs. They know everybody's going to be hearing them because everybody's listening to these programs. So they're going to get a much wider audience who's going to hear about their product and want to buy it. Also, that is going to add into this is the ability to purchase more items through the use of credit. Now, credit has been around for as long as there's been money. Although it's been around a long time, people didn't really use it that much prior to this because it was kind of an embarrassing thing to do. You bought something on credit because you couldn't afford it, right? I mean, you're buying it in an installment because you can't afford it. And that was kind of embarrassing for people to have to admit. So they really didn't buy much on credit. Pretty much everything you saved up for it and then you bought it outright. But in the 1920s, we suddenly have this idea that credit's not a bad thing. Buy it now and, take it home today and purchase it as you go along. The enjoy now, pay later philosophy is going to be rampant. Initially, we start buying like the really high priced items on credit, like our automobiles, our washing machines, our radios, etc. But as time goes on, we start using credit for everything. Everything from groceries to laundry soap. And what this does is it gives us an incredibly inflated sense of wealth. This idea that we have so much money because we have so much stuff. Forgetting the fact that to get this stuff on credit, we are giving ourselves vast amounts of debt. And when eventually the economy starts to falter, that debt is called in and people cannot afford to pay it. And so that is going to create an entire snowball of American problems economically. Probably one of the most exciting of these things to purchase, though, was going to be the automobile. The automobile, I mean, within a few years, became like a staple of Americanness. If you didn't have a car, you just were behind the times. If you were still sticking to a horse and buggy, like, dude, you need to catch up. First of all, it plays a huge role in the economic boom because it's an entire new industry of people building cars, and not just building cars, but also creating all kinds of post-production products. Like, eventually we're going to be able to put radios in cars, and that's not done when you buy it from the dealer. That's going to be something that you put in after the fact. So it's going to create like jobs upon jobs upon jobs, industries upon industries upon industries. So it's really effective in that area. It also helps spur urban sprawl. We can now live further and further and further away from our jobs. That means that people that can afford a car, the middle and the upper classes, can move further to the outskirts of the city and commute inside the city. And that is going to start to separate the classes. It's going to be creating new areas that we are so used to today, the suburbs. Now, the suburbs really don't hit their peak until like the 1950s, but we really start to see them kind of take root during the 1920s. It also helps create new opportunities for young people to get away from their parents. I mean, I'm sure that this is nothing that any of you could possibly identify with, you know, wanting to get in the car and go somewhere with your friends so that you don't have to be home with mom and dad. I'm sure none of you guys could identify with that at all, but the people of the 1920s, boy, this was an exciting thing. And it really changed not only youth culture as far as being able to get away from their parents, but it also changed dating and courtship. Because prior to the 1920s, you courted, meaning that you essentially like, you dated the entire family because you as the gentleman would go to the girl's house and hang out with the family, and that was your quote-unquote dating period. You never went anywhere by yourselves together. But once the car became like the thing, young people were able to get away from the families and experiencing dating by themselves, and it was much more acceptable than it had ever been prior to that. So it changes so many different aspects of American economics, but also American culture. And the man that's responsible for this is going to be Henry Ford. Now, as I've said before, Henry Ford did not invent the automobile. That was invented by Carl Benz. But you can see how much this is going to change. In 1913, workers are able to build a car every 93 minutes, selling for $490. Within just a few years, about a decade, workers are finishing a new Ford every 10 seconds, and they are selling for half the price. That means that more people are going to be able to afford it because there are so many more on the road. It is much more efficiently built, and so it is going to become, like I said, like almost overnight, this like American tradition. By 1929, 1 in every 6 Americans owns a car, and they're going to be bringing in $2.58 billion, creating 3.5 million jobs, either directly or indirectly. It is so incredibly important to the expansion of America's economy, probably more than just about any other invention of the time. Now, while the car is probably the most economically influential, the one that is maybe the most inspirational is going to be the airplane. Now, the airplane is going to be first successfully flown by the Wright brothers in 1903, And during World War I, we did use them to a small degree. We did have dog fights between, us and the Central Powers. There's the great story of the Red Baron, the infamous Red Baron, who was so deadly in the skies. But the thing was, they couldn't really go that far. They couldn't go that high. They just weren't really all that powerful. And people essentially were like, look, these could maybe be used in warfare, but really to a small degree. They could maybe be used as like spying, but that's about it. It sure as heck isn't useful for moving people or moving cargo. So people were just kind of like, oh, it's a neat idea, but it's not really going to work. Well, a New York City hotel owner wanted to push America forward. And so he offered $25,000 in 1919 to the first aviator to be able to fly nonstop from New York to Paris. Now, the thing here, ladies and gentlemen, is that in 1919, I mean, we don't have that capability. Lots and lots and lots of aviators started kind of souping up their planes trying to accomplish this. A lot of people tried, a lot of people failed, and a few people even died trying to compete for what was known as the Orteig Prize. The man to successfully do it is going to be this man, Charles Lindbergh, who completed the first solo transatlantic flight. He flew from New York to Paris in 33 hours, 30 minutes, and 29.8 seconds. He had not slept in 55 hours, and he was in a plane that was so small and was so very specifically designed for this attempt and for this prize that it was not anything like what we consider flight today. The plane that he was on was called the Spirit of St. Louis. And this plane was built for this specific purpose, but so much stuff was taken out of it to make it as light as possible so that they could put as much fuel as possible on the plane to be able to actually just get him there. And so they had to lose the passenger seat. They got rid of a lot of the navigation instrumentation, as well as they are going to even get rid of the heating system. So he's flying this plane thousands of feet in the air with no heat. It must have been incredibly cold and uncomfortable, and to be awake for well over 2 full days doing this is really a remarkable feat. So the moment he touched down in Paris, as you can guess, he was an international superstar. It was difficult for him because he did not like fame and he did not like attention, but he didn't really have a choice in that. He had done what people thought was not even humanly possible, earning him the nickname of Lucky Lindy because he was the first to actually make it across the ocean. And so this is going to inspire lots of people to take to the skies. By the end of the 1920s, we are going to see not only so many more people who are going to be successfully flying. His transatlantic flight was in 1927, but within the next few years, we're going to see more men and more women joining the ranks of pilots. And probably the most well-known of all these is Amelia Earhart. Amelia Earhart is really kind of deserving of recognition. She was probably the most well-known female pilot of the 1920s and the 1930s, but why she was so significant was, I mean, she's not the only female pilot, and I mean, there were a lot of other women that were pilots, but rather she was trying to not only break the records that many of the men had set, she wanted to set records herself. And the one that she was ambitiously trying to achieve was the first worldwide flight. She wanted to go around the world. She got 23 of the 24,000 miles around the earth right before she disappeared. And she disappeared virtually without a trace. There have been all kinds of searches for her, and as time has gone on, and literally within the last year or two, we have actually started to find some pretty conclusive evidence as to what finally did happen to Amelia Earhart and the fated flight. But rather than focusing on her disappearance, which is interesting and also sad, is the fact that she as a woman was breaking these barriers. And we're going to see a lot of that in our period looking at the 1920s. Women taking on these traditionally masculine roles and looking to set their own new standards and break those barriers. Finally, and probably the most important invention of the age, is the radio. So while the flight was probably the most inspirational, the car was the most economically important, the radio changed our culture the most. It changed the very nature of how we as a country communicated. By the time we hit 1929, 40% of American homes have a radio. And if you didn't have one, your next door neighbor probably did. And so everybody across the country is all listening to the same programs. They are all listening to the same advertisements. They are caught up on the same news. And it's absolutely revolutionary to the way that we behave. The first two national broadcasts were the National Broadcasting Company and the Columbia Broadcasting System. And these two are going to set the standard for how radio programs are done. But the kind of unintended effect of this is going to be creating this homogenous culture. Everybody is able to now follow their favorite sports team when they go on the road. Rather than having to read the results in the next day's newspaper, you can actually follow the game as it happens. It makes America much more sports obsessed than it had ever been before, and it never really went away. Entertainment, like I said, everybody's listening to the same programs. Everybody is looking forward to those same programs and talking about those programs when they see each other next. The news, they are able to get updated news immediately because it's going to, we interrupt your regularly scheduled program to give you this breaking announcement. And so you're able to get news instantaneously. As I've already pointed out, advertising is incredibly important because we are going to be able to hear about products that otherwise we probably wouldn't have heard of. And it's going to be great for businesses who are now able to sell to a much wider audience. But the most unintended consequence was a standardized speech pattern. Prior to the 1920s, prior to the advent of the radio, pretty much every single area in America, every region had their own very distinct dialect, their very distinct way of speaking. And some are much more prominent than others. New York and southern areas have always been more prominent than others. But virtually every place kind of had their own way of speaking. But when the 1920s come around and everybody's listening to the radio, that doesn't fly anymore. Most of the radio programs are going to be recorded in New York. It is the entertainment center for radio. Well, no one wants to listen to somebody with a grating New York accent, especially if you're not from New York. If you're in New York, you're used to it. But someone from the South, someone from the Midwest, they don't want to listen to that. And if you are a program that is recording from the South, someone in California doesn't want to be listening to your sweet little Southern voice. And someone in the Midwest isn't going to want to listen to it. No one in Houston, Texas is going to be wanting to listen to anyone that's, from New York, and they're not going to want to listen to anyone that's from, the Midwest, don't you know? So they had to figure out a way to make these radio programs kind of palatable to everybody. So they made up an accent, and everyone that was on the radio had to use this accent. It was referred to as the transatlantic accent, or sometimes called the mid-Atlantic accent. The idea being that it was almost a direct mix of standard kind of like British dialect and an American dialect. And you guys have all heard a standard, this kind of like standardized speech pattern. You've all heard the Mid-Atlantic speech pattern. If you've ever listened to an old-time radio show, you have watched an old-time movie, going all the way up through like the 1950s and even into some of like the 1960s, where you hear people speaking in this very proper American standard sound that almost sounds a little bit English. It's very clear on their consonants, and many times they will roll their R's instead of the way that we just typically pronounce our R's. They roll them. And you guys hear that all the time in those old movies. That's not a regular accent. That was one that was completely made up so that it wasn't identifiable to any one region, so that everyone would be okay with it. The problem with this, though, is that Americans did lose those regional dialects, and it did lose a little bit of that unique American culture as a result, and we had this new homogenous culture. While the homogenous culture maybe isn't a bad thing, it is a little unfortunate that we did lose some of that uniqueness to the regions that we were originally from. So that's it for us today, and we will be picking up into kind of the more interesting elements of the 1920s. A lot of the cultural conflicts as well as the more exciting cultural innovations that we will see come into the Roaring Twenties. So I'll see you guys then.